So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Tax Stories episode number 70. And today my guest is Rita della Feria. You met her probably during my episode number 2. And this is number 70. So thanks, Rita, for your time, for your dedication to this small project. And I'm so happy to see you here.
Thank you so much for having me again. I remember when this was just a pandemic experiment. And now look at you, 70 episodes. So congratulations. It's a remarkable project.
Wow, wow. I'm truly happy to see you here. Thank you for your time. And of course, I will remind our listeners that you are a tax law professor, chair of tax law at the University of Leeds, also international research fellow at the Center of Business Taxation at the University of Oxford, author of countless articles. And is it 5 books now, Rita?
Yeah, it's five
Yeah.
folks. Yeah.
So we'll definitely talk about your new book that is going to be released by IBFD this summer. It's called Taxation and Inequalities. So we will mostly talk about that.
Okay.
And this is the main reason why you're here, of course. And you've been advisor to several governments. You've been named by International Tax Review among top 50 of the most influential tax people in the world. For more on Rita, just go to the episode number 2 and have more information there. But uh, anything else important, Rita, I've missed so far?
No, not at
Yeah.
all. We have. Oh, I'll just mention that we were just chatting before the episodes started about how we have known each other for a decade now. So it's quite a long time
Yeah.
that we have known each other. Yeah, you know what it should be said about me, I guess, because you know me for such a long time now.
Right, right. And one more small episode is that since we had our chat on, I think I don't remember, some 3 years ago, maybe the first time on the episode number 2, then I couldn't imagine this could also evolve on YouTube channel, but here we are, also with video. So we'll have proper video recording this time. So we didn't
Okay.
have that last time. So that's also a small improvement comparing to last time. So okay, let's start where we actually left last time that we spoke. That we should have a little bit more on tax stories and movies. And of course, there is this hashtag. There is always a tax angle on Twitter, or now as we call X. Uh, any most interesting moments to the hashtag series on Twitter from you, Rita?
Well, the last big event was that a tax film almost won the Oscar for best film last year. So Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, I think that was the name. It was a tax story about tax inspection and a misfiled tax return and non-deductible tax expenditure, and somehow twisted into a sci-fi film. Yeah, won loads of awards, became famous, and there you go. Tax is at the center of everything.
Yeah, yeah, right. And by the way, the producer is now my client actually, and uh,
Of
but
course he is.
but uh,
That
I
shows how successful Janice practice is, ladies and gentlemen.
they we spoke that about the Star Wars, that they begin with a war because of a dispute over taxing the trade routes, the Matrix, the Tenet, Ozark, Back to the Future, X-Files had a tax episode, and we spoke also about Minority Report. Uh, since we spoke last time 3 years ago, are we closer to what was reflected on the minority report, that the tax authorities actually could detect the fraud before it happens?
Oh, that's an interesting. So I actually thought that when you start talking about the minority report, I thought you were going to ask me something else. Is it true that tax authorities are requiring more and more businesses to know what is going to happen in the future? And so, and I was going to say yes. Are we closer to knowing, to them knowing? I hadn't thought about it, but probably yes as well. So I think the two statements are true. So interestingly, we can actually make a connection to another film that was released this year. I think it was called Rebel. Can't remember now exactly the name, but Rebel something. So it's a film about basically cuts, expenditure cuts that happen in the police service in some small town in the US. And because the police service is now starved of resources, they start arresting people and trying to get assets from them in order to finance the police services of that town. I'll send you the link afterwards. But
Sure. We'll
but
publish the link to the show notes, of course. Yeah.
but it is in essence, I saw the film and I thought, oh my God, this is actually what is happening in tax. I wrote about it in my 2020 article. In actual fact, that was the first time we met in person. You and I, Janice, was actually when I came to present that specific paper in Riga many years ago. And that is the story. So tax administration, starved of resources, under massive public pressure, are focusing more and more about revenue maximization. And that has sometimes that means going after the criminals or after the fraudsters, etc. But sometimes it doesn't. And what we see is that there is situations in which the objective of revenue maximization is now interfering with taxpayers' rights, and reaching the minority report scenario of being punished for a crime you have not yet committed. But it is also true, and going back to your question, it is also true that technology has advanced a lot, and even since the last time we spoke. The amount of countries that now is using real-time technology so they can see transactions happening in real time has increased massively. So last time we spoke, we were still talking about a handful of countries. It started with, Israel and South Korea, then it spread to a couple of European countries, including my own, Portugal. But now it has really spread out. So several European countries now have real-time technology. I think Poland was the last one to introduce real-time technology just last year. But before that, Slovenia had also introduced real-time technology. And then there is countries outside Europe introducing real-time technology. Uzbekistan has a very sophisticated system of real-time technology. Similarly, Russia has one of the most sophisticated systems of real-time technology. And this technology allows you to see and to make predictions about when fraud is likely to happen. So that reality that we see in the minority report of someone basically guessing at a crime is about to happen, of course, we don't have people guessing, right? So that is the part that is just a story in the film. But we do now have, in essence, AI doing the same role. So we now have many countries with systems that have risk profiling, that have real-time technology, and that are able to estimate more or less, guess more or less where fraud is about to happen. So I think this is an area that has developed massively since we last spoke. There is in the project now on taxation and inequalities, there is a section on digitalization of tax administrations. And I can tell you that the level of, there's 33 countries surveyed in the book. The level of digitalization and automation is widespread. So the levels are different, but everyone now has some level of automation.
Do you see where is it going in, let's say, 3 more years' time?
I think it will continue. And I think it will continue because the advantages of AI are such that it will be hard to resist. And I think that there is two main advantages. The first is that it is extremely efficient and effective in detecting non-compliance, not just fraud, but non-compliance generally. So you see that at the introduction of real-time technology, for example, immediately has effects on levels of compliance. I remember many years ago, one of the first countries to introduce real-time technology, Israel, an official saying to me, "Oh, we don't have VAT fraud in Israel anymore." Of course, that is not true. No, it doesn't matter how sophisticated your system is, you're still going to get some level of non-compliance and fraud. But it is true that these systems are extremely effective. And this is a part of the reason why they are spreading. The second reason, which is not less important, is that they are less costly than people. So what you see in essence is that if you are trying to cut costs on tax administrations and do more enforcement with less money, then automation is an obvious choice. Now, it could be also that you don't actually, it's not even a question of cost, but you just don't have capacity in that country. So that would apply more to developing countries. You don't have capacity in terms of human capacity to feed the tax administration. So you lack experts, in which case, again, automation offers you a great possibility of overcoming that lack of resources. So because it's effective, because it allows you to have less human resources, whether because you want to cut costs or because you don't have those human resources in the country, I think the trend will continue. Actually, finally, I said two, but actually there's three, because I just thought about something else, which I also mentioned in the book, which is the political economy of automation is much easier than the political economy of tax policy. Meaning it is much easier to implement a shiny new software by the tax administration than to approve a brand new law. So the public will notice, the media will give salience to any changes in the tax law that will impact directly taxpayers. Even though these automation measures have massive impact on taxpayers, they are less likely to be salient. So no one notices them, and only tax nerds like us do. And basically, that gives freedom to implementation without going through the political process that can be lengthy, and it can entail a lot of political capital. So you might need to spend political capital on implementing a new tax law that you won't need for a new tax software. So for these three reasons, I think if we have another episode recorded 3 years from now, and I really hope you will invite me again and that I'll come back 3 years from now. I do think that if we speak 3 years from now, this trend will have accelerated. So right. I don't, and this is despite, and we can talk about this if you want as well. This is despite very significant drawbacks on automation. So automation carries significant risks. And not least for the inequalities, which is why I covered that on the book, but also generally there is various risks entailed on with automation. But the other three reasons, the other three advantages are so big that the disadvantages, I think, will be, at least minimized and brushed aside, and the process of automation will continue to accelerate.
Mm-hmm. But if we combine, let's say, Back to the Future movie and your book, then what do you see about the future? Is there gonna be simplification of tax systems a part of the fairness debate, and in a sense that there could be a more simple tax system with, let's say, 4 or 5 different taxes collected automatically, or still the systems will stay as complex as they are.
I think that there is a potential for them to be simplified, but I don't think the driver is fairness. So
Okay.
I don't think that that's why the tax administrations will do it. So I think they will probably try to simplify just because that decreases non-compliance. So as we were saying, non-compliance is not just a result of fraud. There is a lot of non-compliance that comes from negligence. There is a lot of non-compliance that comes from just basic error. And that is partially because taxes are complicated and taxes are costly to comply with. So if you reduce, and there is research done on the impact of compliance costs on levels of non-compliance. So if you reduce the compliance costs, if you make it easier for people to comply with taxes, if you make it simpler, as you were saying, then it is less likely that there will be levels of non-compliance. So in essence, you would reduce in tax administration terms, you would reduce the tax gap. So I think that the driver, I think there will be simplification with automation, probably, but the driver won't be the fairness, which is something that worries me. But actually, the driver will be that actually it makes it easier for people to comply with taxes. And when we make it easier and we remove what behavioral scientists would call frictions, when you remove the frictions to compliance, then compliance levels increase. So I think that's the reason why they will do it.
Okay. Let's stay for a while with movies still. I like this theme that
I do too.
I know you too. Yeah, that's why I have another question, and it's a lengthy one, so please bear with me. But
Okay.
but in essence, the question is how fair it is, and can taxation be fair? But the story goes about one of my favorite movies. It's called Triangle of Sadness. Have you seen it?
No, I have not.
Yeah, and it's an excellent movie, and there was an episode uh, where after a boat crashes in a storm, the people got on an island. It's a luxury boat, and so different classes of people got on the same island. And there was a woman who was a service person on the boat, and now after the crash, suddenly everyone is equal. And she's not a service person anymore, but the one who catches the fish, makes the fireplace, and cooks the fish. And the dialogue between the service woman and the others goes something like this: that the others ask, "Why did you keep half of the fish to yourself and gave us only a half of it?" So, but she said, "But I did all the work," and they say, "Yeah, but we brought logs for the fire, and we don't know how to do the other work." And she says, "That's not enough." So, uh, can taxation be fair? Is it about fairness?
Actually, that scene has so many themes beyond beyond can it be fair. Actually, there is various dimensions to what you just said that I encounter on the research. So I guess I'll start with the following point. For a long time, we thought that if everyone lived better, or many of us, let's put it like this, it's not unanimous held view, but many thought that if we all lived better, then it didn't matter if there was inequality, so long as everyone had the basic levels of how to live, basic food, basic access to healthcare, etc. And what it has been extraordinary about the last 40 years or so since the 1980s, is that you actually see a massive growth in quality of life standards and a massive growth in the income of low-income countries. So what you see is actually a decrease in inter-nation equity. So inequality. So inter-nation equity is higher now than it used to be, and this is not because rich countries are poorer necessarily. It is because those that used to be at the bottom are now slightly better off, right? So what you see is a general decrease in poverty levels around the world. Global poverty levels are on the slide since the 1980s. You also see an increase in quality of life, basic quality of life standards. So child mortality massively down, basic income up, mortality rate lower, life expectancy higher, survival to cancer higher. So all of kind of those indicators of basic access to healthcare, basic access to food, etc., are going up. And yet, what you see at domestic level in richer countries is that levels of inequality have increased. And when you look at that, you basically say, okay, so if everyone is living better, right? And everyone's necessities are satisfied, does it matter that there is higher levels of inequality? And what you see from the data, empirical studies, is that it actually does. And it does because inequality, in essence, is bad for our health, is bad for our happiness, and it fuels a bunch of negative societal effects. So this is a big change from what would have been standard thinking amongst many 40 years ago. So in the sense, that scene that you just described from the film highlights this issue, that inequality actually has an impact, because what happened on that scene that you just described is that those that used to have a higher status now feel frustrated that they can't get the fish, right? So this is in essence the conundrum that is happening at domestic level all over the developed countries. It was already happening. High levels of inequality already existed in many developing countries, but in developed countries, levels of inequality, particularly not so much income inequality, but particularly wealth inequality, has grown massively. So what you see now is that people that seeing that kind of loss of status that comes with higher inequality are actually resenting, just like in the scene of the film that you just mentioned. Now, it also used to be the case that what you knew about other people's wealth or income was basically those around you, your neighbors, people in your social group, your co-workers. Now, with social media, you're seeing it live from wherever. So the lives of everyone, through Instagram, Facebook, etc. So now you're exposed to how little you have, I guess, like all the time. Because you're shown the lives of those that 0.01% on a regular basis. So you're confronted with that loss of status, just like the rich people in the beach that you were just describing in the film. You're confronted with that loss of status, and you just get angrier about it. So what we for the book, what I survey this empirical evidence of the effects of inequality, and what we see is that in essence it makes people unhappier. Funnily enough, levels of anxiety and lower levels of mental health are present not just on the poorer, but actually on the richer. So inequality makes richer people more anxious. And that's because, in essence, the explanation in the empirical studies is that they are fearful. So there is a constant anxiety because the inequality is such, they are fearful that if they decrease their income, they decrease their wealth, they will be back at the bottom with loss of status, right? So it's not just that the poorer are more anxious, or it's also that it makes people at the top of the wealth distribution or the income distribution unhappier. But we also see other societal consequences. So there is now very strong empirical evidence, primarily from political science and sociology, making a causation link between the growth of populist movements and the far right and levels of inequality. So areas where levels of inequality have increased significantly are witnessing higher vote for far-right parties, are witnessing higher vote for populist movements. So people are clearly unhappy. And of course, there is multiple dimensions to that story. But inequality is clearly one of them. We also know that it has consequences on health of people. Inequality has consequences on health. We also know that it has consequences on crime levels. So crime rates are associated with levels of inequality. So there is a bunch of things that are happening, even though we all live much better than we used to on average than we did in 1980. And this was a very lengthy point on your story, but I want to make a second point as regards that story. So the first is the fact that the loss of status of the rich people on the beach now is making them unhappy, right? So, and the consequences that may have. Now, the second part I want to focus on is the reaction of the former cleaning lady that now catches the fish, right? And her reaction is, why would I share the fish? Because, you know, I am the one that catches it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So her status, from her perspective, her status has now increased significantly. And now she is exercising that status by trying to capture more of the resources, in this case the fish, but we could say in our modern society's income, wealth, etc. So now that she has higher status and a higher level of resources, she wants to keep them, right? This is also a very interesting point, because what we see in terms of historical and empirical evidence is that in periods of high inequality, like the one that we are witnessing at the moment, you would expect to be an increase on redistributive policies, because the majority is asking for more redistribution, just like the people on the beach saying, you know, why are you not sharing more? You know,
Mm-hmm.
and there's like 10 of them, and there's only this woman versus one that is catching the fish. So you would assume that at least in a mildly democratic, but even in autocratic regimes, if you have a swell of people that are worse off, then you would have a call for more redistribution, right? Saying, you know, this one person has a lot more now. There's 10 of us. So this fish should be redistributed, right? We want this fish to be divided equally between all of us, right? And this is actually not what we see. So historically, the empirical evidence is uncontrovertible. In periods of high inequality, there is actually not an increase on redistributive policies. The opposite, actually. And this actually has baffled many academics. So from this, so you see empirical studies on this issue, this paradox. So if people are self-interested and they want to maximize their own wealth, they want to all eat the fish, why are they not complaining more? Why are they not calling for more redistribution of the fish, right? That would be what you would expect in a fully rational society, right? That people would say, okay, you know, if you have a redistributive policy, all of us, and there is a policy of dividing the fish in equal parts, all of us will get a little bit of the fish. So the fact that this doesn't happen has baffled political scientists, sociologists, social psychologists for decades now. So there is a literature for about the last 20 years or so of why this is happening. Why are we not seeing more redistributive policies worldwide? And historically, so it's not just now, it's basically this has happened over and over again in history. There is various explanations for it. Probably there's not just one cause. So there is possibility that the political process is captured by the richest. So it is possible that there is some, the woman that now has the fish, you know, becomes the leader of the people at the beach, and she says, you know, no redistribution, right? So there is various possible explanations for it. I think one particularly convincing element to the story is that we know that in moments of high inequality, people become more focused on identity and those around them, safeguarding those around them. This is also the reason why, or it's thought that this is the reason the populist movements and the far-right movements are growing, and the opposition to immigration is growing in the context of high inequality, because it also is fueling this sense of identity. So why give it to others when, you know, we are suffering, right? So that same logic applies to you and your family. So you're less keen on giving. In essence, it decreases social cohesion if there is high inequality. So a key element, I think, of this story is that when you have high inequality, people become more selfish. So even though they may actually benefit from redistribution, they don't know that for sure. So they don't really support it because they're trying to keep it for their family, right? And for those close to them. And it's very interesting in the study in my book. So in the project that I conducted, that you see this actually playing out is actually extraordinary, because you have. As you know, Janice, but maybe those that are listening to us don't. The project involved 33 countries, and there's national reports from each of those countries, including a Latvian report, as you know. Report after report comments on people are unhappy about the levels of inequality, particularly wealth inequality, but also income inequality. So economic inequality, broadly speaking, right? Because the book also covers issues of non-economic inequality, like gender, race, etc. But people seem to be, report after report, comments on people are unhappy about the levels of economic inequality. And then a few pages later, I asked them, one of the questions on my questionnaire was, how do people feel about inheritance taxes? And the reason why I ask that is because, as probably most people listening to us know, inheritance taxes are probably our most effective mechanism against wealth inequality. So there are wealth taxes, but they are extremely hard to design. There is not a good history of success with wealth taxes. So the most common and probably practical way of curtailing wealth inequality is stopping it spreading to the next generation. So preventing basically the wealth inequality now to be moved intergenerationally to your children, to your grandchildren, etc. So you would expect, if people are unhappy with wealth inequality, that there would be high support for inheritance taxes, right? Not so. This is the most consistent result in the whole survey. Every report says that people in their country don't like inheritance taxes. And what is funny is that sometimes they actually think it's their country only. So often reports will make a reference, oh, they don't like it because of specific design features, because it applies to this or it doesn't apply to that, etc. But the truth is that the dislike is universal. So the design is irrelevant. So different countries have different designs, right? So some countries exempt direct descendants, some don't. Some have high thresholds, some have lower thresholds. Some have anti-avoidance clauses. Others do not have anti-avoidance clauses for donations, for example, right? And yet, some have high rates, like the UK has 35% rate, right? Others have very low rates, right? It doesn't matter. Everyone hates them. It doesn't matter the rate. It doesn't matter the exemptions. It doesn't matter the scope. It just doesn't matter. So everyone hates them. So how do you put that? How do you reconcile that with I am unhappy about wealth inequality? And this is symptomatic of this problem that has been the general problem that we have been identifying in the literature, which is just because people are unhappy about wealth inequality does not mean they actually support measures to stop wealth inequality. Because when it comes to it, they actually, for a bunch of other reasons, some of them not conscious, so some processes are cognitive processes that are unconscious. Actually, they will oppose measures that are redistributive. And on inheritance taxes is very noticeable the trend. So in the last 20 years, several countries in the sample abolish inheritance taxes. And those that have kept inheritance taxes have decreased its scope, mostly to exempt direct descendants. So the trend is very clear. It's not just that redistribution is not increasing. Redistributive taxation is decreasing in the last 20 years, even though people are unhappy about wealth inequality. And this was a very, very long explanation to a small scene of the film. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. That's great because we are talking mainly about the book and the findings in your book. In that regard, I wanted to ask, is this something to do with taxation at all, this inequality issue? Because when I was looking at, for example, Gini coefficient, yeah, which is sort of metrics of inequality as adopted in many societies, then on the top of inequality list of EU, there was, for example, Estonia with flat income tax rate of 20%, and at the bottom of the inequality ratio was Slovakia with 19% flat income tax rate. So basically, just 1% difference, the same or similar system, but completely different inequality at the different ends of this inequality spectrum. So, is it something to do with taxation at all?
So again, this is a very interesting point. I'm very excited about the project. So every point, I guess, is interesting. But this is a very interesting point. So it's not that it is necessarily related to taxation, but the issue is that taxation is a method of decreasing inequality, because you can have redistributive taxation. But what I find most interesting about the question you just asked is that it actually depends on whether you take the tax system in isolated terms, which is what you just did. So, you have a flat rate income tax. So actually you did something else. You didn't say the tax system as a whole. You said one specific instrument of the tax system, right? So which is the personal income tax, right? Now, is that the benchmark for equality and inequality? Or should we assess whether the measures are redistributive, not just by looking at one tax, but looking at the overall tax system, or looking at the overall public finance system? So what do you do with those taxes? So taxes are collected with an objective, right? So how you use them presumably makes a difference. If you decide to use the taxes in a redistributive manner to decrease inequality, is that still okay? So one of the sections in the book or in my report is about what I call the benchmarking of equality. So if let's assume we want to tackle inequality, right? So let's assume that this is our objective. Do we have to do it tax by tax? So analyze what do we do about the personal income tax only, for example, or should we make VAT less regressive, for example? Or do we look at the overall tax system, so the tax mix, and say it doesn't matter if VAT is regressive because you can compensate it with personal income taxes, for example? Or alternatively, do you look at the overall public finance and you say, actually, it's not just a tax system, it is also about how you spend it and the welfare system. And if you collect, even if you collect flat rate taxes and the system overall is not progressive, so not just the personal income tax, but the overall tax system is not progressive, it is still okay because we can redistribute via public expenditure by helping the poorest. And it is very interesting that in this area, as opposed to inheritance taxes, the attitudes of the countries in the samples are very different. So you have some countries that actually have a constitutional mandate that says that every tax has to be progressive, including consumption taxes. So, which is a bit insane, because the progressivity in excise taxes, when you're trying to curtail negative externalities, is just a crazy thought. But so there is so in some countries there is a constitutional mandate that every tax has to be progressive. In some countries, it is just stated that the overall tax system has to be progressive, or that it has to be in line with the ability to pay principle, which is very common in many constitutions, right? And then in some countries, there is actually an explicit acceptance by government that it is the public finance. So actually, we're not so worried about the progressivity of the tax system because we redistribute through the welfare system, right? And here is the kicker, right? The countries with lower levels of inequality in the sample, i.e. the Scandinavian Nordic countries, are countries that use the public finance mix, are countries that do it through the welfare system. And they are actually very explicit on the reports. We don't have, for example, tax credits for this or tax credits for that, because we do this through public expenditure. We do this through the welfare system. Similarly, it's not just the Scandinavian countries, like similarly, Austria, specifically, the Austrian report specifically says we do most of our redistribution through the welfare system. So there are very distinct approaches to this. And what is interesting is that the assumption that the most progressive tax system will lead necessarily to lower inequality doesn't pan out on the empirical data, because the countries with lower inequality are countries that are doing it, at least in our sample, which are mainly European countries, right? There's a few non-European, the big economies outside Europe, so the US, Canada, Australia, China, Brazil, but the majority of reports are European countries, right? And in that sample, it is very evident that the countries with lower inequality are countries that are doing it through the public finance mix, not through individual taxes.
Right. You mentioned this progressivity, and even in some constitutions, is the progressive income tax somehow reflected in the fairness topic? Is it? I know that most countries there is this progressive income tax, but is it okay to have a flat rate tax, or what's the sort of debate there on between progressive and flat rate tax system?
Okay, so one of the themes of the book is that it's always about the tax policy is always about trade-offs, right? So the majority of times there is no absolute right or wrong. It is on balance, A is better than B. And in this situation of the progressive versus proportional flat rate taxes, it's also a question of on balance, A is better than B. Flat rate taxes are simpler to collect. And what you see in the sample of the 33 countries is that several of those countries have moved to flat rate taxes, primarily in Eastern Europe. And very few have done the opposite direction. And there is even a couple of countries in the sample that have gone progressive, then flat rate, and then tried to implement progressivity, and no one wants to go back to progressivity. And those countries that have moved to flat rate invoke simplicity as one of the key elements. Flat rate taxes are just simpler to collect. Now, the countries that have lower inequality do not have flat rate taxes. So they do have progressive personal income taxes. The key differences are actually in other areas. So less tax expenditures. So they apply less deductions, tax deductions, because they do it through the welfare system. They also have notoriously less VAT exemptions and reduced rates. They don't try to do through the VAT system. So the VAT system in those countries is the efficiency of the VAT system tends to be higher. But they still have progressive taxes. The key issue is this: if your objective is still to decrease inequality, and so this is a big assumption, right? Because if politically there might be countries that don't want to decrease inequality, right? But let's assume, for the purpose of our argument, that you want to decrease inequality. It's still possible to do it with a flat rate system, but you have to do a lot on the public expenditure side to compensate for that, right? So you have to have a very, very strong welfare system in place to compensate for a non-progressive personal income tax. Right. So the issue is how many countries are actually at the level that can compensate with a welfare system for that lack of progressivity on the tax system, right? And probably there aren't that many in the world that are capable of having a welfare system that compensates for a proportional flat rate tax system, right? So it is technically possible. It is unlikely to actually be able to be implemented in the majority of countries. So it remains the case that to the large majority of countries, if you want to have progressivity, if you want to decrease inequality, then the tax system has to help, because the welfare system probably in the majority of countries is not capable of doing it on its own. I mean, it can help, but on its own. So even as I said, even in the Nordic countries, which have a very strong welfare system, they still have progressivity on the personal income tax. They don't have the tax expenditures. It's true. They don't have the VAT narrow base, but they do have the progressivity. And this is because they think they can't compensate fully on the expenditure side.
Right. But if we stay with the income tax, then I remember when I read this Thomas Piketty book on 20 just capital in the 21st century, and his suggestion was that the wealth in private hands grows faster than the economies of countries. So we should apply tax to this growth. Is that somehow reflected in the research?
No, So this is the actual dilemma that we were talking about earlier. So you do see, so what he's saying is correct in the sense that you do see a significant growth in wealth inequality at domestic level. So again, this is not internation. That has been decreasing, but at domestic level, you see a significant growth in wealth inequality, and those at the very, very top of the income distribution, so the 0.1%, are actually speeding at much quicker rate. So he is correct on the analysis of the problem. Well, as you would expect, because he's a very well-regarded economist. What he is probably not incorrect, but overly optimistic, is that we can do something about it specifically. And why I say this is because when you look at the data, again, it's not only inheritance taxes that have been decreasing. Actually, wealth taxes have as well. So in the beginning, 20 years ago, you would have had several countries in the sample that had a wealth tax. There is now a reduction to only three countries in the sample. 3 countries and some jurisdictions in Switzerland. So 3.5 countries that have wealth taxes. So if you would, we go back to the paradox of high inequality versus the redistributive policies. If you were expecting that high inequality that he identifies in the book to result in higher levels of taxation of wealth, actually the opposite has happened. And we go back to why is it happening, right? I mean, because, this would affect a very small number of people. So it's not even like you're protecting your family, right? So in the case of wealth taxes, I think that the reason is probably more about mobility than about psychological phenomena. So in the case of wealth taxes, the key issue is that people that are at this level of income are highly mobile, or sorry, this level of wealth are highly mobile. So they are not bound by borders. So if you tax them too much, they can just move. And the issue is that having people with high inequality, high wealth and high income in your country has a bunch of spillover effects that may be attractive to your country. So for example, even not leaving the tax sphere. For example, they might pay a lot more consumption taxes because they consume a lot more. Right? So your consumption tax base increases if you have people in your country that are high wealth, high income, right? But even other things like personal income taxes can also increase. So some years, and this actually is connected to not just the decrease in wealth taxes, but I'm going to take a sidestep with the growth on preferential tax regimes in personal income taxes. That's another key trend identified in the book. There is a lot more countries with preferential tax regimes. So you have countries that have had it for a long time. So, for example, the UK or the Irish non-dom regime has existed for decades, right? But you have a lot of countries that are implementing new ones in the last 15 years, more or less. This is now widespread. I think I don't want to give the wrong number, but I'm pretty sure that it's now 19 out of the 33 countries have some type of preferential tax regime to attract outside workers. Now, the configuration of that regime, of who does it target, at what level, etc., is different. Right, so some are targeting specific high skilled in specific sectors. For example, there is a couple of preferential tax regimes in Europe for IT workers, so specifically to specific skills. Others are more general for people on high incomes, high skills. Others are connected with levels of wealth, like, for example, being able to buy properties, etc., in the country. But there is key objectives that are common to all these preferential tax regimes. And there is two key dimensions driving them. So two key motivators driving these regimes. The first is that mobility that we were talking about, right? So it is true that wealthy people, the wealthier you are, the more mobile you are. So this is why wealth taxes are probably decreasing, because, you know, wealthy people can move around. But it is also true that that mobility is extended even to people that are not at that level. It is much easier to move now than it used to be. So one of the key objectives of many of these regimes is to attract high skill, high income individuals, even if they are not at that wealth 0.1%, but they are at the top 10% of the income distribution, for example. And so you want to attract people that are at that level because, in essence, they are bringing extra income through the VAT, through the property taxes, etc., or because they are bringing extra skills. So a lot of countries are just trying to attract people with high skills, right? The second dimension, a key objective that is common to many of these preferential tax regimes is that they are trying to attract young people because they are facing a demographic challenge. So what you see in these regimes is not just about attracting just people with high income regardless, but actually specifically targeting a high-skilled young people, because in essence the country is losing, through the mobility, is losing people. So demographic challenges are such that people are having less kids. So we all know this. In Europe, we are in demographic decline for quite a long time. And B, the few people, young people that there are going to the richer countries. Right? So you see a lot of these preferential regimes actually trying to attract high-skilled young people, not just because of the extra revenue that they will bring on consumption taxes or property taxes, etc., but just because the country needs people. And it needs people with skills that will basically sustain the older people that exist already in the country. So just to mention, like my own country, in Portugal, now has, I think, three key preferential tax regimes. One of them is a general high-income individual, high-skill, high-income individuals attraction. So the two objectives are there. But the other two are clearly to do with this demographic. So one is to prevent young people from leaving the country. So actually offering a tax break, lower taxation for people until the age of 35 that are highly skilled. So saying, in essence, don't leave the country, we will tax you less, but please don't go to Germany or to Denmark to work. The second regime is to attract people like me that have been, so I have often told this story that I received many years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I actually received an email from the Portuguese embassy in the UK, a standard email saying, alerting me to this, is it time to return home? And basically the program is called the Return Program, and it basically offers preferential tax regime to people that have Portuguese citizens that have been abroad for a long time but want to return. So that have been abroad, I think it's for over 5 years, and want to return to the country. Now, clearly this is not just about high income people attracting high. This is really about the demographic challenge, right? That we're talking about. So in response to going back to your original question on Piketty, yes, the problem is real, but tackling it is very difficult because at that level of wealth, people are very mobile. But even at lower levels, So when you talk about the top 10% of the income distribution, the mobility is also very high. So what you're seeing is the reverse. Rather than taxing more, we're taxing less because we're desperate to try and retain people with high skills that are young, that can work, etc. So the tendency that we see, the trend that we see, is exactly the opposite of what Piketty says it's the solution in his book.
Mm. So you, from what you're saying, actually, it resonates with Latvia a lot, because in the previous podcast episode we were discussing that since regaining independence in 1990s, Latvia lost more people than during World War II.
Wow.
And that's exactly what happens, and what is the policy challenge for this country as well. So, but does it mean that with the abolishing non-dom system in UK, still countries will go with many exemptions? So this sort of there are many trade-offs in the system to go away from different sort of main principles like fairness and inequality. So these are more important, right?
Yeah, so one of the key elements on the book, overarching topic in the book, is that there are many trade-offs when you try to achieve fairness. There are trade-offs inside the tax system, trade-offs within fairnesses. And I'll give you an example in a minute. But there are also trade-offs with objectives outside the tax system, like you're just saying, right? So if your objective is to maintain a high level labor supply, then fairness is not your main concern.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So because, if you have no people working, then you have a bigger problem, right? So what you see is that trade-off playing out on these preferential tax regimes. These preferential tax regimes are not just not progressive, they're highly regressive, because you're exempting people on high incomes, right? So the trade-off is you're doing it partially because you're trying to boost tax revenues and etc., and have the spillover effects on your country, but also because you have this very real problem of demographics. So how do you deal with this problem with them? That is more urgent in the minds of many policymakers than the issue of equity and fairness, right? But there is also trade-offs of fairness within the fairness concept. So we have been talking a lot about economic inequality, but one of the parts of the book is talking about other inequalities that are not non-economic inequalities, such as gender, age. So what is known in human rights as the protected categories. So age, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, gender, etc. And sometimes what you see is that there is a trade-off. So if you try to protect one of those inequalities, it might have negative effects on another inequality. So the concept of fairness is not monolithic. There is various sides to that fairness. So a key example that comes out in the book is the issue of gender inequality versus income inequality. So several countries have approved measures to address gender inequality, such as child tax credits, household tax credits, to basically encourage women back into the workforce after giving after childbirth. And this is because there is very consistent research to indicate what is known as child penalty. So in many European countries and North American countries, it would be the same. You have more or less parity in terms of gender, in terms of income, earning, etc., until a certain level between men and women. And then what happens is that as soon as there is childbirth, that men's careers have no effect, but women's careers plateau. And this is not just about income, but about other things. So one study that I cite on the paper that is the study is very dear to me, talks about the effects on academic publishing. So it turns out that men and women publish more or less at the same rate as young academics until they have children. And then at the moment that they have children, men continue to publish at the same rate they were before, but women publication rate decreases. And it decreases not just immediately after the childbirth by something like 40% compared to men, but actually that effect remains many years after the childbirth. So as soon as they give birth to a child, their productivity, their academic productivity decreases. And in academic terms, I mean, if you don't publish, so there is this old saying, you publish or perish. So publication is the livelihood of academics. So of course, teaching is a key element of every academic's career, but publishing research is an extremely important element, one that gives status and gives visibility, etc., etc. So it's a key element of a career. The fact that women stop publishing means that their career and their status is immediately smaller than those of men. So in order to tackle these problems, this type of problems, many countries have introduced these child tax credits, this household. So Scandinavian countries now have, not just, but mostly in Scandinavian countries, mostly Nordic countries, a few other countries as well, like Luxembourg, have household tax credits. And that basically gives a tax credit for work done at your home. So such as, I don't know, cleaning, ironing, babysitting, etc. And again, this is because it is known from a bunch of empirical evidence that this work is done mostly by women. So in order to decrease that gender imbalance, allowing women to publish more in academic circles or to go and work more hours in a law firm, you basically compensate that by saying, okay, this is tax deductible if you hire someone to take care of your kid at 6 p.m. Okay? What is the problem? The problem is that, both academics and people working law firms are at the top of the income distribution. So in essence, there is a risk that if you approve this type of tax credits, this actually increases income inequality.
Supports wealthy, yeah.
Yes, because you're giving tax credits to the wealthiest, because people at the bottom of the income distribution do not have housekeepers, regardless, right? Regardless of the tax credit, right? So often because they don't even have nothing to credit to, so they don't even pay taxes because of other allowances in the system, right? So it doesn't matter to them. So when you approve this type of measures to decrease gender inequality, you may have a negative impact, distributional impact, so a negative impact on income inequality. These are the type of choices that you have to make. Now, I'm not saying, and I want to make this point, I'm not saying that you shouldn't approve these measures. I'm saying that there is a choice. It's the same thing for the preferential personal income tax regimes that we were talking about. There is a choice to be made to pretend that these tax policy choices do not have a negative side, do not entail some kind of trade-off, is disingenuous, because they include trade-offs, and some of them are very big trade-offs, so very significant trade-offs.
I also wanted to ask about this mobility issue you mentioned. There's a quite popular book. It's called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I read it recently by author Robert Kiyosaki, and he suggests that to switch from heavily taxed employment income to assets that produce passive income are taxed lightly, comparably. Are countries afraid to tax all types of income equally because of this wealth mobility issue, or there's another reason?
There is actually another efficiency reason. So there is another reason at the origin of why this differential taxation was initially approved. So there was, and the optimal taxation theory literature, it would have often been defended many decades ago that capital income should not be taxed at all, actually. And then we moved on the optimal taxation literature. We moved to tax less, and this is basically to compensate for the fact that corporate income taxes exist. So in a way that income is already being taxed at the level of the legal entity, and therefore it should be taxed less. I'm simplifying, but that's the basic idea. So the origin of this distinction is a big part of it is actually efficiency. So this is a trade-off between equity and efficiency of the tax system. So it is less efficient to tax certain types of income. When you look now at the trends, it is clear that this is now creating problems in terms of inequality, because it's not just as you're saying about income, but actually other types of inequality. So there are now reports and studies indicating that, for example, this increases gender inequality. This increases racial inequality because people from racial minorities or women are less likely to have that type of income. So it is undeniably the case that this is now a concern in terms of inequality. The origins of it, I think, were the efficiency concerns. I think you are right that if you put now into the context of policymaking in 2025, a lot of it is about mobility. So even though the origins of the distinction are on the optimal tax theory and efficiency considerations, I think a big concern now is these people that hold this type of investment are mobile, or, this type of investment itself, capital itself, is highly mobile. So, you better not interfere with this.
Considering your book in general, do you have some, I don't know, top 2, 3 recommendations for tax policy makers from the essence of your book now, from the 33 chapters that you have compiled?
I actually have one, just which is be honest. And be honest primarily about the trade-offs. Because we have used this slogan, tax fairness, constantly for the last decade or so. And people are expecting something to happen. And when that thing doesn't happen, they get angrier and angrier. And the reason why it doesn't happen is because it is not a simple objective. It is a very complex objective, full of trade-offs, like we were just talking about, right? You mess with one thing, you have an effect on the other thing, right? And we are often not honest with people. From a policy perspective, we're not honest with people in saying, actually, it is complicated. And I know why they don't say this, because it's basically, it's very difficult. It's not as intuitive from a political perspective to say, it's complicated. It's not a satisfactory answer for a politician to give. But this is the truth. It's complicated. And the problem is that the more we pretend that it's not complicated, the more people get angrier when the results don't come. So that is my problem. It's not my problem. I understand why they're doing it. I think it's storing problems for the future, because when the thing that you promise, which is this tax fairness, doesn't happen, for example, because you have demographic challenges, right? And people get angrier. So you said that this was going to happen. So you increase the salience of the tax fairness issue by saying, we are implementing tax fairness. And then people see no change. And it discredits the system. It discredits their belief in politics. It discredits their belief in the tax system. So I just before we finish, I maybe give a key example of these trade-offs. We
Sure.
already talked about gender, the demographics versus fairness. Let me give you just one other example. Environmental taxes. We often say this sentence, we at policy level. So you hear this at policy level from policymakers, from NGOs, etc. Fair and sustainable taxation. The problem is that the term is often contradictory in itself. And why? Because environmental taxes or environmentally focused excise taxes are known to be highly regressive. Not a little bit regressive, highly regressive. So what you see is, in essence, that many countries have approved in the last 20 years carbon taxes for good reasons. So again, this is not to speak against those taxes, but we know they have a negative distributional effect. They will punish the poorest. So when we increase taxes, for example, on fuel, I, for example, drive an electric. It doesn't affect me, right? But electric cars are expensive. It will affect those that have a car that hasn't been changed for 20 years. Or those that can't afford to live in the city center and have to live on the outskirts and have to commute by car. So I'm just giving you an example that hopefully is intuitive for people to understand that something that is not just about fuel tax. All environmentally focused taxes are known to have regressive effects, right? This doesn't mean that we shouldn't do them, but when we're doing them, we are prioritizing the environmental objectives over the equality issue. We are saying at this moment in time, it's more important to have environmental sustainability because our planet is literally burning, than issues of equality. But you saw the reactions, for example, the Yellow Vests protests in France. It's about this trade-off, this exact trade-off. People that actually are using these products are getting angrier because they have to pay for the costs of that. Now, let me give you an example on the other side. When Ukraine was first invaded by Russia, and you saw a spike on energy costs, several European countries decreased consumption taxes on energy products, whether VAT or excise taxes, right? And this was said, obviously, the objective of this measure is to help the poorest. But you could frame it in a completely different way. You could say, we just gave a tax credit, a tax cut to products, to the consumption of products that are bad for the environment and have negative externalities from a geopolitical perspective because we buy gas from Russia.
Yep.
So at this moment in time, we basically decided that protecting the poorest was the most important. And that's fine. I have no problem with saying at this moment in time, this is more important. What I have a problem with the lack of acknowledgement that this actually has other negative consequences. And the negative consequences is we are increasing or subsidizing the consumption of products that are bad for the environment and that gave a subsidy to, this case, the invader, right? So there is geopolitical consequences to the measure. There is environmental consequences to the measure. At that moment in time, we prioritize equity. Other times we prioritize the environment. But these are the trade-offs that we are facing. And again, the issue for me is not the choice that is ultimately made. I accept. I'm a Democrat. I accept whatever choice the politically elected policymakers make. But what I would like to see is the acknowledgement of trade-offs. So the key message of the book is be honest for policymakers, be honest about the trade-offs that we face, because if you're not honest now, you're storing problems for the future because people will just get angrier and angrier.
Thanks, Rita. Our time is almost up, but there's one important question I wanted to ask about your book, still about the constitutional framework of fairness and equality. That I saw that there are many references to constitutions of many different countries. Do you see a unified principle that what are the best practices of what should be included in constitutions regarding those issues?
So I need to be careful here because I'm not a constitutional lawyer. So and before I'm shot down by them. I wouldn't feel comfortable recommending best practices, but there are clear trends. So there is a universal adherence to principles of equality and non-discrimination. So every country has some reference, whether in the constitution or through international treaties, subscribe to international treaties, etc., that commits to upholding the principle of equality and non-discrimination. There are, however, in practice, key differences. So first of all, key differences even before you reach taxation, just at a constitutional level, even though everyone is supposed to be protected equally, there are differences amongst countries on some inequalities. So for example, it is very noticeable that there are different attitudes to the protection of sexual orientation. So in some countries, you have high standard of protection for discrimination on sexual orientation. Some reports specifically note that in practice, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation receives a lower level of protection than other inequalities. The second point that you also see is as regards taxation. There are many countries that have sub-provisions that apply equality and non-discrimination to taxation, but not all. So you have many countries that have the principle of ability to pay, for example, or principles like non-confiscatory taxes or non-retroactivity of taxation. But there are many countries that have nothing about taxes on their constitution. So you have the whole spectrum as regards taxation, from countries that say that the constitution is completely silent about taxes, to countries that have very detailed constitutional principles on taxation. I think the most extreme example of this on the sample that I have is Brazil, that has a highly detailed tax principles on its constitution. We call this in the project the hyper-constitutionalization of tax, but it is very evident, and the reason for it appears to be connected to the federal structure in Brazil. So the constitution, in essence, tries to ensure that every state in its federation applies the same principles by constitutionalizing it, in essence. So it appears to be related to the structure, but it is unbelievably detailed, and it's miles away from other countries. So you have countries with nothing at all, you have countries with something but only like 2 or 3 provisions, and then you have Brazil, which has literally dozens and dozens of tax rules on its constitution, which makes it, of course, very, very difficult to change. So on this regard, it's probably interesting for people that are interested in this topic. Read the Brazilian report, the way how long it took to change the constitution for the recent reform that they had of consumption taxes, because it has a constitutional reform. So if you constitutionalize everything, then you need to basically a very high majority to change the constitution. So yes, there are reasons to do it, but there are also very high risks associated with constitutionalization of tax principles.
Right. Rita, it's been such a pleasure to discuss these issues with you. I really recommend everyone who's interested in these topics do buy the book and read this for yourself during summertime when this book is coming out. And as always, I have so many questions. I think there are many more episodes. Maybe we should do, but that's for the future. But I have the same question as previously. Is there any change to your reply regarding why we are doing what we are doing?
I don't remember what was my initial reply, so it's very hard to know if it will be the same. But I will say that I am much more concerned now than when we probably talked 3 years ago about the path that we are on. So I think the world has changed since we last spoke. And my concerns were always, and even when we spoke at that time, were always about the rule of law. But I'm now more concerned about that. And I'm more concerned as well about the level of dissatisfaction that a big part of the population, particularly in our continent, in the European continent, is feeling. So I don't know what I replied 3 years ago, but for me, this is something that has changed in the last 3 years. My levels of concern about the path are higher. So my advice, I guess, it goes back to what I said earlier. Be honest with people. If you're not honest, you're storing up problems for later.
Thank you, Rita. I truly appreciate and admire everything you said. Thanks for that, and hope to see you soon in person.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope this will not be my last time. It's my second, but hopefully not the last time on Tax Stories. Good luck with the podcast. It has been a great pleasure to be a listener as well as a speaker.
Thank you, Rita. Appreciate it. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye. I had also questions about Bugs Bunny and Astrid Lindgren, but we didn't have time. So definitely, this is something to store in my library for you for next time. Absolutely.
But in any event, I hope to see you soon.
Yeah. Thanks, Rita.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Appreciate it. Bye.